Hello. I've called this meeting to give you my answer. I'm sorry to say, we reviewed the college, its student body, its promises for the future, and we have our decision. At this point, we declare officially that...
Wait! Don't we get one more chance to plead our case?
Well, you've had ample opportunity to present your case already, and that would be highly irregular and inappropriate. I don't see what you could possibly say that would change my mind.
So... Now, I know we're not the most conventional school out there. We're small. We read the works of dead white men with admittedly ridiculous names. We spend far too much time discussing terms we already know the definition of. We're not particularly good looking, and most of us are crazy. Hey! Right. But I'll tell you what St. John's is. I'll tell you what St. John's gave us that nowhere else ever could. St. John's gave us. When I read Kant or Plato or even Lobachevsky, I learned things about myself that no technical school could show me. I learned that you can't take the easy way out to get what you want. I learned who killed Barb Buchanan and McDowell. I learned never to cheat on a woman who can punch out a mountain. And I know that I am not alone.
I learned from Luke.
I learned from Shakespeare.
I learned from Kierkegaard.
I learned from Nietzsche.
I learned from Augustine.
I learned from Lobachevsky.
I learned from Nietzsche.
I learned from James Joyce.
I learned from Max Planck.
I learned from Dostoevsky.
I learned from Dostoevsky.
I learned from Nietzsche.
I learned from Levinas.
I learned from Hegel.
I learned from God.
I learned from Lobachevsky.
I learned from Plato.
I learned from Bach.
I learned from Nietzsche.
I learned from Shakespeare. I learned from Whitman.
I learned from Shakespeare.
I learned from Rousseau. I learned from Shakespeare.
I learned from Flannery O'Connor.
I learned from Machiavelli. I learned from Nietzsche.
I learned from Shakespeare.
I learned from Camus.
I learned from Plato.
I learned from Melville.
I learned from Dostoevsky.
I learned from Oscar Wilde.
I learned from Tocqueville.
I learned from Kant.
I learned from Nietzsche. I learned from Kierkegaard.
I learned from Willa Cather.
I learned from Dostoevsky. I learned from Epictetus.
I learned from St. Augustine.
I learned from Jonah.
I learned from Hobbes.
I learned from Epictetus.
I learned from Lincoln about rhetoric.
About love and order.
That Russia sucks.
About God.
About suffering.
About honesty and love.
About spatial experience.
About bird girls.
About suicide.
That's not about women. About politics.
About morality and love.
About geometry and innovation.
About life and purpose.
About self-knowledge.
About God and fish.
About knowledge.
About human experience.
About human greatness.
About fear. About insanity.
About sympathy.
About human freedom through faith.
About Gentiles.
About freedom.
About the sacrifice of Isaac.
About sex and power.
About faith.
About truth.
About love.
About the true power of art.
About the general world.
About comedy.
About murder and wit.
About quantum mechanics.
About quality and experience. About poetry.
About philosophy and Christianity.
To kill the innocent.
About active citizenship.
About memory and land.
About violence and human nature.
About how to see God in other people.
About music.
About stoicism.
When I look back at the greatest works of history, I see me looking back. A better me than I would have been. And I know that I am only who I am today because of St. John's. St. John's! St. John's!